Hello, I'm Franey, the Director of International Programming for the festival, and we're delighted to have here for a discussion now the filmmakers, Neill and Jim Speers, who are co-directors, co-producers, co-writers of the film. Welcome. Wish you could be with us in Vancouver, but nice to speak with you now.
Thank you, Al.
Can you tell us where you are exactly?
Oh, I'm in Auckland.
I'm in Porto, in Portugal. I'm usually based in London, but I've just, we had to leave our house for a few weeks and we thought we'd just come here. A friend of mine has a place here, so we just come to stay.
You're New Zealand filmmakers, so too, when did you leave New Zealand for London?
I left New Zealand in 2010. So yeah, like 11 years ago now. And we're sort of been back like once in that time for like about a year, but then for most of that I've been outside of there, sort of between sort of London and Japan mostly, I'd say.
Okay, so the obvious first question about the film is how the two of you as New Zealanders came upon this subject or decided to make the film.
We Tu and I met at art school in Auckland. I was teaching and Tu was a student who was making a very strange opera, but that's another story. We were talking about, I think, really the Southern Ocean whaling that New Zealand is very aware of. And the Japanese whaling in the Southern Ocean around New Zealand and Australia, and what a strange place it occupies in our imagination as this kind of difficult subject for people of this part of the world. And that got us talking about Japan and what it would like to be a whaler, really. And that's where that conversation started, at least in my memory.
Yeah, I think we're at the pub. I was back from London for a bit, and Jim and I met for a beer, and I was sort of talking about ideas because we'd actually worked together on a film in China, which Jim was making, like an art film about the Huangpu River and the Suzhou River in Shanghai, and he invited me along on that trip, and that was pretty sort of free-form sort of documentary making, but we were there for a month and it was amazing. We were out on barges and stuff in the river, interviewing all these workers out there and stuff, and yeah, we made a really cool little film. And after that I'd come back to New Zealand for a bit, and we're in the pub and we were like, oh, we should make something, and he was like, have you been thinking about anything? And I was like, oh man, I've always wanted to get on board like that massive whaling ship, the Nishin Maru, in the Southern Ocean. And they were like, how would we go about doing that? And it was like, oh, it'd be pretty hard, I imagine, to get on board that boat. We were like, I don't know, maybe we could start by doing something, locally, and see where we get with that. And I'd just been filming a series in Japan, so I'd just spent about a year there before Jim and I had met up on that job in China. So I'd spent a bit of time out there. I'd really enjoyed being in Japan, and one of my really good friends and actually a collaborator on this film, Kentaro, is from Japan as well, and he was one of Jim's students too. So we were all kind of friends, and we'd actually had a bit of some heated discussions back in the day, I think, about whaling, and I'd always sort of, been interested as to why, Japan really insisted on continuing it, when it was, a large portion of its post-war history has been about rebranding itself. And, as this sort of positive kind of influence on the world and culture and all this sort of stuff. And that seemed like one kind of industry that really I guess, was at odds with that new image that they were trying to portray, and I didn't really understand. And the film, The COVID, came out, and we sort of, he was telling me like, it just, so much of that imagery was out of context, and it didn't really, provide anyone there with any opportunity to speak for themselves, really. And it felt so, I guess, like the filmmakers didn't really understand the culture or the place. And I was like, that's really interesting. And I think that was where the early kinds of conversations started there. And then Jim and I were talking, and Jim had sort of said, I might be able to find some money, in a research grant to maybe go over and do something. And I was like, oh, that sounds great. And so we started writing stuff up, and Jim kind of managed to get that across the line. And then we were like, well, let's go meet up in Ayukawa. We'd looked at a bunch of kind of small whaling towns that are still left in Japan. I think there may be 4 or 5 in total. But we just, I don't know, we felt drawn to that one for some reason, and we started doing a bit of research. And anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Jim, do you want to jump in there?
Well, I think the whaling issue was interesting for us also because for New Zealanders, there's a ongoing conversation about what self-determination means for cultures, especially in particular Indigenous cultures. And it felt strange for some of the same people who would affirm that in our context to have some difficulty with the idea that Japanese communities should at least be able to have a conversation about what they want to do in their own environment. And that's a complicated issue, and that's sort of somewhere that we started, how do you negotiate that? And one of the issues for us was possibly, well, we'd better go and talk to them, see if they'll talk to us, see if we can find out more about the subject, really, as simple as that. And we still wouldn't claim to be experts on the subject by any means. We've just talked to a few people in one town, one very small town. But it's a very small industry now, employs about 1,000 people, with an oversized impact in terms of a profile in the world as an industry. So that's interesting of itself.
I think when I first saw the film, which was months ago, I was struck with its insights into Japanese culture and the material culture of Japan. So it's obviously not just a film about whaling, but we in Vancouver, we're on the Pacific Rim, New Zealand, Japan. Even though we're so far apart from each other, there are some commonalities, and I think there's a lot to be learned from each other's perspective. Greenpeace, of course, was founded in Vancouver. I used to work for Greenpeace in 1975, and there's some very strong anti-whaling feelings here, and we have a lot of Japanese people who live in Canada and Vancouver, British Columbia. So I think it's a fascinating film from the perspective of our shared Pacific Rim. And I wonder if some people would stay away from it because it is about whaling. But my thoughts when I first saw it, I was struck with how bracing it was in terms of an encounter with the other. A very respectful, listening to and trying to understand a culture that is not only different, but that has challenges which are historical and that are important for us to understand. So how do you think this film will play in New Zealand? Has it already? Have you had New Zealand audiences see it?
No, we've tested it. We haven't shown it to an audience, properly. And I think there will be some people who choose not to watch it because it's about a subject they find difficult. And I would rather that as an outcome than make a film that everyone agreed about. And I think one of the underlying principles that motivated me was I don't really want to make a film that everyone feels, everyone has the same relationship to the subject matter. It doesn't strike me as very interesting. I want to use the making of a film as an opportunity to find something out and maybe not resolve something, I don't think we're in the game of resolving things.
I think there's it's a super emotional subject matter, particularly in New Zealand. And so you could definitely see why some people might look at it on the surface and be upset by it. But I think, part of one of the things that I was really interested in was, there's been a lot of efforts to try and get the Japanese to stop whaling, particularly after the moratorium in the Southern Ocean. And, very few of them have been that effective, I think. And I think a lot of that is potentially to do with, the way that we in the West have sort of gone about that, which has been from a place where it's like, we're here and you're here. And you need to listen to what we're going to tell you right now. And I don't think that works in very many circumstances, that relationship when you want to get something from someone. And I think part of, ending this industry, I think, would be is the ability to be able to talk about it and listen, and understand. For me coming from New Zealand when whaling ended, there was very little fallout for me. It's easy for me to be to be anti-whaling because I have no connection to it. It was a very abstract thing for me, and I think for most people in the West, I'd argue, and that's just not the case for these people, and it's not the case for many people in Japan for many reasons. One of which being that it fed the entire nation after the war, and so when something has that closer connection, I think, to you and your livelihood and your well-being, then it's harder to kind of say goodbye to that, I think. And I think that's something that's worth understanding, from an outsider's perspective, particularly if you want to stop, this sort of that kind of activity. So it was more just trying to provide an opportunity for, particularly like an audience. I'm from New Zealand, and I was always, actually my uncle is Roger Payne, who's, a great marine biologist who's one of the first people to discover whale song. And Roger, I was really nervous when I told Roger that I was making the film, and but he was really generous, and he said, it probably is a good thing for people to hear and to understand this. I don't know if he's watched it or not. I think I sent him a screener out of politeness, but he understood, I think, what the goal here is, and I think opening that kind of discourse is really important, I think, to kind of move forward. But it can't be I don't think it'll happen from like a place where you're trying to shout at people to stop doing stuff. I don't think that really works either. So that was sort of another thing that interested me about it. Yeah.
To what extent is each of your own filmmaking experience ethnographic? Do you consider yourselves ethnographic documentary filmmakers, or was this a bit different than what you're normally doing?
I think we could be, but I don't think we'd define ourselves in that way. I think there are a lot of things we'd like to do, but if you applied ethnographic to everyone, I'd be in. If ethnographic is just about looking for things that are ostensibly and obviously different to yourself, I'd be a little nervous about that. But Yeah, I think we're both motivated by an interest in things that we haven't met before and perspectives we haven't encountered. But I think they can be local as well as at a distance. It is more difficult though to work. Well, it's a different kind of challenge working in your own neighbourhood, and we haven't done that together yet. And I'd like to do that. I don't think our future is necessarily, focused out there. But it is. We are interested in people as a subject, aren't we, too?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I mean, yeah, I don't know if ethnography is necessarily what drives me. It's certainly something I'm interested in, and I'm interested in all parts of the world and traveling and meeting people and hearing stories and gaining alternative perspectives on the world and that sort of thing. I studied languages a bit when I was young. I'm half Māori myself, and so I think, identity has sort of been something that's inherently part of me, trying to work that out. But it's, I think, but it's like, part of finding that out about yourself and stuff is going away and seeing how other people view the world. And I kind of, I don't know, I don't want to go on a rant about colonialism or whatever, but, I think that was one of the saddest things about it all, was the loss of perspectives, like alternative perspectives on the world. And so I am, quite interested in that. I'm interested in how different people see and understand the world, and how that can be very different from like what, dominant views on certain things, which often come from the West and the Anglo-West, so it's sort of, I'm always interested in, and that things are often really pretty grey, not black and white at all, and and super complicated, but that complexity is cool. It's not, I think it can be hard to make films that explore that too, because I think, so many narratives are driven by like dichotomies, and really black and white kind of stories. And so I think it can be difficult to present a film that tries to, whose position is to not have a position, I think is pretty difficult pitch. I think it's something that a lot of people are like, oh, so what do you guys think about it? And I'm like, well, I don't think it matters. I'm not interested. I don't think it's interesting what I think about it. I think it's interesting to hear what they think about it. But, I'm just one of a million other voices that has nothing to do with it, who, has an opinion. But it's sort of much more interesting for me, I think, to hear from people.
We'll never use voiceover.
Yeah.
If I can just say something about what I think that if you were here with us, that might come out in a discussion with the audience, and might be worth you hearing from an outsider perspective, someone like me watching the film, is that, I see a lot of films, and I see films that are set in many parts of the world. And, Japan is particularly interesting as a culture for us, I think, because of its history and material cultural, as I said. But I think your film does have a tremendous quality, which is all too rare, which is, you could almost describe it as aesthetic, but aesthetic seems somehow a reductive term, that, it's just an interest in the aesthetics of things. But it's beyond that, because I think the vision of the film is very intense. You really feel in a space where you feel the people, it's palpable, and you feel the environment and objects, not just in the present tense, but documentation of objects and places and rooms and landscapes in some of your historical material speak louder than words. And to me, your film had a wonderful sense of cinematic virtues and enabling us to be immersed and to almost time travel into a place that we can understand so much better than if we just visited it now or read a book. You know, I think you've combined the elements in a way that we take for granted, but when you experience it through cinema, it's very, very special. So I just want to compliment on your achievement here.
Thank you. A lot of the experience of making it centered on that a kind of materiality that we found, you know, and the information that was provided to us by the people that were kind enough to talk to us. I mean, I was just, as you were speaking, thinking for me about Mrs. Kanoi shows us photographs of their, Mr. and Mrs. Kanoi show us photographs of their family and where they lived after the war. And at one point, there's a photo of a relative that was in the army. And it's a simple thought, but I just thought, a Japanese person has never shown me a photograph of a family member who was in the war. I've seen a lot of photographs of European soldiers who were in the war, who exactly the same format, filmed in their uniform. And even now when I think about it, it feels like a sort of an event, if you like, in my life to have an affinity for this image that I'd been kind of trained to not have an affinity for, you know, and I have nothing to do with the Second World War. Why would I approach that image in a way that was so encoded? I guess that's how culture works. You know, and it's just to state the obvious. This person that's in this image is very alive for those people and in that home, just as this practice is for those people. You know, and so that you learn a lot through that generosity of people sharing, being prepared to open their homes up. And I mean, they're very fundamentally generous in their approach to us. And the thing that the conversation we would have with Kentaro a lot, because it's not easy working in another language, right? Well, we're not working in that language as we don't speak Japanese, but to be trying to find things out when you don't speak the language. And we would be saying to Kentaro, why can't we just get what's the problem? Why can't we make it? This seems we're frustrated on this thing. And I remember him at a certain point saying, well, they don't need to say that to you. I know you would like them to say that to you, but they don't need to say that, and they won't if they don't want to. That is not a Japanese way to respond to the question. So either reframe the question or move on. So there was a lot of that. It's a very interesting experience for us, I think. Yeah.
I think visually as well, it was, you know, a lot of that kind of, you know, we have like a really collaborative process, I think, Jim and I, because we shot the whole thing ourselves as well. But we, you know, I went to art school and then I left art school and I didn't become an artist. I just started working in film as an editor and then eventually directing stuff. And, you know, and in that sense, I became much more like narrative kind of driven. Whereas, you know, Jim has maintained like a really, really good art practice. And I think, you know, what happens is we're in a space and, you know, I'll be just getting all the bits we need to put it together and Jim will be like pointing the camera at the sea for like 20 minutes and I'll be like, what are you doing, man? And you're like, I don't know, I think it's good. And I'm like, that's not good. And then we get to the edit and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so glad I did this with Jim because there's just this wealth of beautiful kind of imagery that's, in a way, it's outside of the kind of frame of the narrative, but it helps kind of build a real richness, I think, you know, in the imagery. And so it's really good. It's really good to kind of work together in that regard, I think. And, you know, I hope that came across for sure.
Thank you so much for making the film. really, and allowing us to show it. And we should probably wrap things there, but I just want to say that I hope lots of people get to see this film in Japan, New Zealand, and other parts of the world.
Cheers for the interview, man. And we hope everyone enjoys it there, and we're really sorry we weren't there to kind of be in the cinema with you guys. I'm hoping I get to see it in a cinema soon. But yeah, no. Then thanks so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
All right. Cheers. Thank you.